We want to examine the Cold War and really take a look at it from the Soviet perspective and see how the issues, goals, and long-standing themes really play into that. The thing is, when we think about the Cold War, what is it? How do you define it? There's not really one answer, and that might help us to figure out if there is a Cold War today. So take a minute and think about how you might define the Cold War. Some common ideas, and maybe some of these are the ones you came up with. Balance of power, just a general rivalry between two major powers. Some might classify it as sort of a showdown between people with nuclear weapons, or perhaps military alliances as we see take shape, or some just sort of classify it as competing ideologies, capitalism versus communism. As I mentioned, these are common ideas. Here's an idea maybe you did not come up with, something if you look at the political cartoon and read the caption, this isn't necessarily one which most Americans would hear in a narrative. Also, some might claim it's actually American domestic policy in terms of perpetuating a Cold War to justify certain elections or perhaps justify certain foreign policy goals. In any event, we want to think about when did it start then. Depending on how we define the Cold War, might actually lead us to figure out when it started. So what would you say is the start of it? Maybe a date or an event? Curious if any of you thought of 1877. If you look at the cartoon, we see sort of the defender of civilization with Russia depicted as somewhat barbaric, but again, the concept that we need to contain them. If you didn't say that, or you did say that, we see a shift in policy in March or really February of 1917, depending on the calendar you use, where we see this sort of great bear being ushered in. And this is Kerensky's provisional government, which was very liberal and very progressive. And certainly the United States recognized that government. But we see a shift again in October of 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. If you look at the caption down below, we have democracies sort of shunning the Soviet Union with their hand out. Or maybe some of you said the Civil War. And if you look at this postcard, you can see the Red Army in the middle. This gives insight into the Soviet perspective, and those are the gentlemen with the red coats on. And if you look at their position, they feel encircled and trapped. I put an arrow on the right. You can see the American cowboy that's there. And during the Civil War, of course, the Allies did invade the Soviet Union with the hopes of supporting the whites to maybe get them back into World War I, or the hopes of really taking down the communist government. So perhaps this is actually the real start of the Cold War as we see, so again, that idea of mistrust. But most people would say the Cold War started during World War II. It was really military strategy that set the stage for a divided Europe, but it was formalized by a creation of military alliances. And that brings us here to the big three. This is the picture of them at Yalta. So take a minute and think about what are the war aims for each of the three countries represented here. Well, we'll start with Stalin. That might be the easiest for you. Stalin, of course, has the same goals and aims as Peter the Great. He wants to be a great power. He wants a sphere of influence. He wants warm water ports. He wants industry. And certainly he wants to win and get reparations at the end of the war. Churchill's goal is the goal that we've seen throughout the entirety of our study of Europe this year, and that's to preserve the balance of power. And Churchill knows that he needs France to be a major power, and he needs Germany to be a major power too. And that's his goal. When we think about FDR, that might be the hardest to come up with in terms of the U.S.'s goal in terms of World War II. If we think about U.S. foreign policy towards Europe, it's mostly been don't go over there, stay away, bad things happen. And he really has no long-standing goals other than just win the war. But what we see again is the decisions that were made during these conferences really set up for a divided Europe. When we think about the decisions, this is near the end of the war at the Yalta Conference. Now, conferences had been held earlier, which gave some of these decisions, were solidified at Yalta than they were earlier. We do see sort of the declaration for what's going to happen in Eastern Europe, and FDR had already hinted to Stalin earlier he didn't really care about Poland. You see the concept of the United Nations, and really how Germany will be dealt with and what Russia would do. After the war, people say, how could FDR go and give all these concessions to Russia? How could you basically sort of send a sick man over there and give everything away? The reality is, though, Stalin sort of came through on every promise that he made. At this point, the Soviet army is 3 times bigger than all of the Allies put together. FDR is unsure if the bomb will be ready in time. And the Soviet Union wants buffer states. They're getting a little tired of getting invaded, and they certainly want the Straits of Constantinople, and they really want some of that German industry. Also at this time, the U.S. is bogged down in the Battle of the Bulge. So in terms of the U.S. gave it all away, they really don't have a lot to bargain with at this point. If we see again, look at this map, the strategy was very telling. All right, the Soviets will come in from the east, the other allies will come in from the west. And so when we talk about a divided Europe, well, that was pretty much the plan in order to defeat Germany. Well, here we have another conference, and we see some new faces. Stalin is still there. We see Truman now because FDR has died. So Truman's been in power for 3 months. Truman was never in the inner circle of Roosevelt. He wasn't well liked by Roosevelt. Anything he knew about Yalta, he had to read about it in the paper. And Clement Attlee is there in terms of Churchill. Churchill started the conference, but then there was an election, and he is voted out. And so we have Stalin who's been there for about 25 years. We have Truman for about 3 months, and we have Clement Attlee who's been there for about 3 weeks. Of course, from Stalin's point of view, he's been doing all of the hard work. He thinks he deserves a lot more than just some reparations and some territory. He really wants the Straits of Constantinople. Again, we know that he wants that in the sphere of influence. He wants basically industrial materials too from the Eastern Zone. And Truman didn't have the same relationship that FDR did with him. He actually starts pulling back some of the loans to the USSR. And Stalin's taken back by that. He's wondering, I've been doing a lot of the work here, Truman. Why are you going to stop loaning me money? We also know when Truman gets to the conference, he is alerted to the fact that nuclear weapon is tested and ready to go. The reality is that Stalin knew about that before Truman ever did due to Stalin's spies in the Manhattan Project. So when Truman tells him, hey, Stalin, I have a powerful new weapon, Stalin's like, yeah, I heard about it before you probably. But now we know certainly that's something that Truman has at least to bargain with. Churchill now decides to come out and make a speech that's actually done in Missouri, certainly to the concept of the Iron Curtain. And then Stalin provides a reply to him. So take a few minutes and listen to the clip, read Stalin's reply. And as you do, I want you to think about what are Stalin's valid remarks that he makes. I'm sure you notice that Stalin had some very valid points. And again, it sort of goes into the Soviet perspective of what he wants at the end of the war. Additionally, at the end of the war in 1946, France has an election, and actually 30% of the vote goes to the Communist Party. So communism was appealing. Communism was spreading. And certainly what he says to Churchill about getting voted out for the Labour Party seems to be a direction that many places who are devastated by the war are leaning more towards the Communist Party. Well, the Soviet mentality then is, well, we are tired of losing so many people. We need those buffer states. We don't want to get invaded. We were invaded by Germany. We were invaded by the Allies. We were invaded by Germany again. We kind of need to stop doing this. And so the mentality that Stalin has with among the people is genuine in terms of preservation. Well, Truman decides that he's going to come out with a doctrine, and this is, of course, aimed at Greece and Turkey because of their strategic value in the Mediterranean, but also to Europe in general. He kind of overplays the idea that communism and Tito and Yugoslavia is really going to spread in Greece and Turkey, but Congress does decide to give him $400 million in order to combat this. So we see again for Truman, he's perpetuating the idea there's going to be 2 worlds, and you need to contain one of them, the other rival. Also in 1948, there's another election in Italy, and the Communist Party actually almost wins there, and the CIA goes in to basically help the election along in a different direction. It kind of gives insight into what we see over time, the inflated faith in covert operations as containment. This is actually the real way to contain communism, and that's the Marshall Plan. Communism isn't as appealing to people when they're not as poor. So the concept that you help build up the devastated areas, that you give loans to people, was certainly something that was effective. It also works like a store credit. So it's a win-win for the United States. We lend you money, you buy products and materials and goods from the United States, and then when you rebuild, you get back the money in those loans. And this was something that was successful. The issue is Stalin's like, am I going to be included in this Marshall Plan? And of course, Truman says no. And once Stalin knows that Truman's not going to give him any money, we see again other issues develop. He decides then that Eastern Europe will be blocked from aid. He will have his own package to provide them. We see the issues in Western Berlin, and that's with the airlift that takes place. And additionally, we see in 1949 that they're going to have NATO. And most people think it's an overreaction. It's prompted by the situation in Berlin. But now we see something that's going to go against the decision at the Yalta Conference, and that is the UN will no longer be able to solve solutions, or we don't have faith in the United Nations to preserve peace. We need a military alliance in order to do so. And what we see then, the Soviets have their own in response to NATO, and they get the Warsaw Pact together. Other domestic issues for the United States is who lost China? Of course, the communists, and there had been a civil war in China prior to World War II. When Japan invades, they have to sort of put down their differences to combat Japan. But after World War II, we see then that the Communist Party will prevail. One of the criticisms of the communists during World War II was to the United States saying, why don't you give us more money and more help? We could actually really fight Japan a little bit better. And some people speculate they didn't really want to bolster the Communist Party. So who lost China is really just a domestic issue used to justify elections. There was really sort of no winning China if you phrase it that way in the end. We also see the Korean War, where you have the United States and the United Nations forces really going up against the proxy wars then of the Soviet Union and China and North Korea. When that ends in 1953, it ends for a couple of different reasons. One is Eisenhower's done with it, and he goes through the back channels of Sweden, and he says, well, I'm going to basically use nuclear weapons. There's another major domestic issue that occurs in 1953, which also makes it realize that we need sort of a ceasefire in Korea. And I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, and you know me by now that I'm not going to tell you the answer. But we see really this, that the Cold War is far-reaching around the world. We see the policy of containment. We see the idea that proxy wars will be fought. And it's going to be set up then for the next person who comes into power in the Soviet Union.